start off by reading a very short quotation. There's another book that has come out since Snyder's book, another big attack on Stalin by another Ivy League professor. It just came out. It's about the first half of Stalin's life, and it's by Stephen Katyn, who is at Princeton. So I haven't had a chance to look at it. It just came out last week, but it's already been reviewed. So I just thought I would start off by just reading a little quotation here from the review in the New York Review of Books, the current issue of the New York Review of Books, of this volume by Katyn, not the Snyder book, which I'm going to get to in a minute, but this new book. This is a review by Richard Pipes. Richard Pipes is now retired, but he was a professor of Soviet history and Russian history at Harvard for many, many years. He's a right-winger. He's on the right of the spectrum, although they're all anti-communist, of course. And that having been said, he is not a stupid man. He knows, to some extent at least, to a large extent, he knows the sources and so forth. He has his biases, but he's not a stupid man. Now notice what he says here. Starts off the review. He says, according to Alexander Yakovlev, a member of the Politburo and the closest advisor of Mikhail Gorbachev, who as chairman of a commission to study Stalinist repressions had access to all the relevant records, Stalin was responsible for the death of 15 million Soviet citizens. Now, I think that's very interesting. There's no way that there's any evidence that Stalin killed 15 million people. Snyder, whose book I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, strives mightily to come up with a figure of 6 to 8 million, and that's all false too. But certainly if there was any evidence of more than that, Snyder would have been more than happy to put it in. Pipes doesn't say he thinks Stalin killed 15 million people. He says Yakovlev, who's now dead, said that Snyder killed that Stalin killed 15 million people. So you see that the level of dishonesty that goes on around here, right? He's trying to mislead people into saying that into thinking that he's asserting this, when in fact even he doesn't assert that. So all of these, there's just the anti-communist, anti-Soviet, and anti-Stalin particular juggernaut rolls on. And so I want to pause here. I want us all to pause and consider one particular work that came out a few years ago, and that's this book by Timothy Snyder of Yale University called Bloodlands. So let me begin my presentation, all right? As many of you know, I've specialized in studying Soviet history of the Stalin period for many years. And for the past 9 years, I have done this virtually full-time aside from my teaching. My talk today is based on my new book. The full title of my new book is Blood Lies: The Evidence that Every Accusation Against Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union in Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands is false. Plus, what really happened in the famine of 1932-33, the Polish operation, the Great Terror, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet invasion of Poland, the Katyn Massacre, the Warsaw Uprising, and Stalin's anti-Semitism. Blood Lies is a very thorough examination of Yale professor Timothy Snyder's dishonest work, Bloodlands: Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Published in 2010 by Basic Books, New York, Snyder's Bloodlands is the most widely known and by far the most successful book to date to attempt to equate Stalin with Hitler, the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany, and communism with Nazism. It has received many awards and prizes and has been translated into 26 languages. Snyder himself is a public intellectual whose essays frequently appear in journals like the New York Review of Books and the Times of London. When I first encountered Snyder's Bloodlands back in 2010, I immediately recognized, on the basis of my prior research, that a number of the so-called crimes and atrocities which he alleges against Stalin and the Soviets are untrue, in plain language lies. Discussion with friends and colleagues assured me that Bloodlands is indeed influential, an important anti-communist work whose claims have received wide acceptance. I decided to systematically check every single piece of evidence, every footnote, all the documentation that Snyder cites to attempt to prove any crime, atrocity, or wrongdoing by Stalin, the Soviet leadership, or pro-communist forces. At that point, I had been studying allegations of crimes by Stalin and the Soviet leadership of his day for about 6 years. I thought I would be able to prove that some, perhaps much, of what Snyder alleges was false, anti-communist, anti-Stalin lies. But I also thought that I would finally find evidence of some crimes, atrocities, or wrongdoing by Stalin and the Soviets. I reasoned as follows. Snyder has a phalanx of professional anti-communist researchers to help him. Most of them are from Poland and Ukraine, countries where the post-Soviet nationalist mythology excuse me, is based on anti-communist lies. Others are German, French, and Russian. Parenthetically, I had to learn Polish and Ukrainian, at least on a reading level, in order to do the research necessary for this book. I already knew Russian, German, and French. So I thought, surely this team of highly motivated anti-communist researchers, thank you, with the resources of their national governments, archives of original sources, and universities behind them, would have uncovered at least a few crimes of Stalinism. I was wrong. What I discovered was that not a single one of the dozens of allegations of crimes and atrocities in Snyder's book is true. Either Snyder's evidence does not in fact support the claims he makes, or Snyder cites secondary sources that make these claims, but the statements of those secondary sources are either not supported by evidence, or, once again, the evidence they cite does not support their conclusions. In many cases, Snyder and the anti-communist researchers upon whose work he relies are guilty of bias of omission, of remaining silent about evidence that refutes their fact claims, but that few people know about. Blood Lies, my book, is over 580 pages long. That is because I reproduce the primary source evidence that I cite in the original language, Polish, Ukrainian, or Russian, and some German, together with my own English translations. This has made Blood Lies significantly longer, but it is essential to include this evidence. One of the most important lessons of my research on the Soviet history of the Stalin period is this: all primary source evidence must be checked. There is so much dishonesty, so much deliberate deception in the citation of primary source evidence by anti-communist historians that no historian of this period should be assumed to be honest. And of course that includes myself. I cannot ask readers of my book to simply accept my conclusions either. I must make available to my readers all the primary source evidence so they can study it for themselves. And this is what I've done. Snyder and other anti-communist and anti-Stalin historians do not do this because they cannot do it. The evidence simply does not support their anti-communist, anti-Stalin claims. So in their footnotes they refer to hard-to-find documents in rare collections, or secondary sources in Polish or Ukrainian in hard-to-find books and journals. And when you find those articles, they often have no primary source evidence, or just have yet further citations to yet other hard-to-find books in Polish or Ukrainian. It's like the old-fashioned confidence game called the shell game, with the evidence playing the role of the P. Under which shell is the P? The answer is under none of them. There is no P. No evidence to support Snyder's anti-communist, anti-Stalin claims. Bloodlands, therefore, is a completely fraudulent book. Not a single allegation of crime, atrocity, or misdeed of any kind on the part of Stalin, the Soviet Union, or pro-communist forces holds up. My research completely dismantles Snyder's invidious comparison of the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany and Stalin with Hitler, and proves that Snyder's book is based upon lies, pure and simple. In addition to alleging dozens of crimes, so-called crimes of lesser scope, Bloodlands focuses on 8 major ones. They are as follows: the collectivization of agriculture, the famine of 1932-33, the so-called Holodomor, the Great Terror or Yezhovshchina, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the alleged Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, the Katyn Massacre, the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, and Stalin's alleged anti-Semitism. I discuss all of these allegations in detail in my book with full reference to the best contemporary scholarship. These 8 historical falsehoods are the subject of this presentation. These falsehoods are so widespread that many people on the left, perhaps I should say on the quote left unquote, but you know, many people who consider themselves on the left believe them. They have been promoted very strongly by anti-communist scholarship for many years. 1. Collectivization and the famine of 1932-33. This is a brief account of the 1932-33 Soviet famine as supported by the primary source evidence now available. It is based mainly upon the research of Professor Mark Tauger of West Virginia University. Tauger has spent his professional life of more than 20 years studying famines and is a world expert on Russian famines. Famine has struck Russia hundreds of times during the past millennium. A 1988 account by Russian scholars traces these famines through historical records from the year 736 AD to 1914. Many of these famines struck Ukraine as well. According to Tauger, and this is a quote, the Ukrainian famine of 1928-29 was the 3rd famine in the Soviet Union in 7 years due to a natural disaster, and was the most extreme part of a broader food supply crisis that affected most of the country. The Soviet Union clearly had an extreme vulnerability to natural disasters, and Soviet leaders interpreted this vulnerability as a sign of agricultural backwardness. For Soviet leaders, the Ukrainian famine, this is 1928-29, was an important part of the argument that Soviet agriculture had to be changed. The collectivization of agriculture was designed to end the cycle of famines that had tormented Russia and Ukraine for centuries. It was a reform, a significant improvement in the security and lives of the peasantry, and therefore the entire population. It was not undertaken to tax or exploit the peasants or to extract value from the countryside. On the contrary, during the decade 1929 to 1939, the Soviet government spent tens of billions of rubles on agriculture. Quoting Tauger again, their primary goal was increasing food production by using what seemed to be the most modern and reliable methods available at the time. We know now from primary source Stalin and the Bolsheviks viewed collectivization as the only way to swiftly modernize agriculture and put an end to the wasteful and labor-consuming cultivation of individual land holdings, often in widely scattered strips. Let me pause while the repair here goes on. Just let me read that sentence again. Stalin and the Bolsheviks viewed collectivization as the only way to swiftly modernize agriculture and put an end to the wasteful and labor-consuming cultivation of individual land holdings, often in tiny, widely scattered strips. They used the large-scale, highly mechanized agriculture of certain American farms in the West as models for the Soviet farms. 2. The famine of 1932-33. 2 incorrect explanations of this famine are widely accepted. Ukrainian nationalists claim that Stalin and the Bolshevik leadership withheld grain from Ukrainian peasants in order to export it, deliberately starved Ukrainian peasants to suppress Ukrainian strivings for independence, or both. This is the myth of the Holodomor. Consciously modeled on the Jewish Holocaust, it originated in the anti-communist Ukrainian diaspora. These forces had fought on the side of the Nazis and had fled to the West with German troops as the Red Army advanced. A more mainstream but still politicized interpretation states that the famine was due to the collectivization of agriculture and excessive state grain requisitions, which led to disruptions, mismanagement, and peasant rebellion, and ultimately to famine and starvation. This is the official position of the Russian government and of those anti-communist scholars who do not accept the Holodomor myth. Neither of these explanations is borne out by primary source evidence. The question of grain exports. The official position of the Russian government and academic establishment is similar, that the famine was caused by excessive grain requisitioning and by collectivization. This hypothesis is erroneous. According to Mark Tauger, and I quote, "The severity and geographical extent of the famine, the sharp decline in exports in 1932-33, seed requirements, and the chaos of the Soviet Union in these years all lead to the conclusion that even a complete cessation of exports would not have been enough to prevent famine. The harvest of 1932 essentially made a famine inevitable." The reality is that collectivization put an end to famines in the Soviet Union, except for a serious famine in 1946 to 47. Stephen Wheatcroft, author of the most recent study of this 1946-47 famine, has concluded that this famine too was due to environmental causes. 3. The Yezhovshchina, or Great Terror. We know now from primary source evidence that Yezhov, who was the head of the NKVD, the Internal Police Directorate, acted directly against Stalin's and the Soviet leadership's intentions. We now have the telegram sent on June 17, 1937, just prior to the June 1937 Central Committee plenum, in which Yezhov transmits the request of S.M. Mironov, NKVD chief in Western Siberia, reporting the threat of revolts by subversives in concert with Japanese intelligence. In it, Mironov reports that Robert Echa, first Secretary of Western Siberia, will request the ability to form a troika to deal with this threat. Apparently, Echa and then a number of other first secretaries approached Stalin and the Politburo after the Central Committee plenum and asked for special powers to deal with conspiracies, rebellions, and revolts in their area. This led to the Politburo decree on anti-Soviet elements of July 2, 1937, which authorized all first secretaries to arrest kulaks and criminals who would return to their areas, shoot the most dangerous of them, and exile the rest of them. This vision of organized internal revolts in conjunction with foreign powers, Japan in the case of Western Siberia, occurred in the context of the Tukhachevsky affair of less than a month earlier. In that case, the top commanders of the Red Army were convicted of collaboration with foreign powers in a plot to overthrow the Soviet government. The loyalty of the military commanders was in grave doubt. Rightly so, as we now know. I have a chapter on this in my book on the Kirov assassination. The NKVD appeared to be the only force that the Soviet power could rely upon. It did not become clear until much later that Yezhov himself was conspiring with foreign powers to overthrow the government and party leadership and was using massive executions of innocent people to stir up resentment. For the next year or more, Stalin was flooded with reports of conspiracies and revolts from all over the Soviet Union. A large number of these had been published in Russian. Undoubtedly, a great many more remain unpublished. It is important to ideologically anti-communist researchers that these mass murders be seen as Stalin's plan and intention. Anti-communist Russian researcher Vladimir Nikolaevich Khaustov is honest enough to admit that the evidence does not bear this out. He admits the existence of a major conspiracy by Yezhov and concedes that Stalin was deceived by him. Khaustov admits that Stalin acted in good faith on the basis of evidence presented to him by Yezhov, much of which must have been false. Yezhov himself admits this in the confessions of his that we now have. 4. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The truth is that the Soviet Union did not invade Poland in September 1939. However, so completely has this non-event passed into history as true that I have yet to find a recent history book in the English language that gets this correct. Of course, the Soviet Union had never been an ally of Nazi Germany, which is what all the anti-communists say. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a non-aggression pact, not an alliance of any kind. The claim that the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany were allies is simply stated over and over again, but is never backed up with any evidence. The complete text of the pact is online. It is short. Anyone who reads it can see there is no alliance of any kind. The secret protocols to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not plan any partition of Poland. The Soviets wanted to protect Poland. The Soviets wanted to protect the Soviet Union and therefore to preserve an independent Poland. The point here was that if the Polish army were beaten, it and the Polish government could retreat beyond the line of Soviet interest and so find shelter, since Hitler had agreed not to remain further into Poland than that line. From there they could make peace with Germany. The Polish state would have still existed. The Soviets did not do this out of any love for anti-communist and anti-Soviet Poland. The Soviets wanted a Polish government, any Polish government, as a buffer between the Soviet Union and the Nazi armies. The betrayal by the Polish government of its own people frustrated this plan. Well, what about the alleged Soviet invasion of Poland? I'll begin with my conclusions. First, the Soviet Union did not invade Poland. Secondly, everybody knew it at the time. How do we know this interpretation of events is true? 1, I have 9 reasons. One, the Polish government did not declare war on the Soviet Union. They did, of course, declare war on Germany. Two, the Polish Supreme Commander ordered Polish soldiers not to fight the Soviets, though he, of course, ordered Polish soldiers to continue to fight the Germans. Three, the Polish president, who had fled to Romania in September 17th, tacitly admitted that Poland no longer had a government. Four, the Romanian government tacitly admitted that Poland no longer had a government. Five, Romania had a military treaty with Poland aimed against the Soviet Union, yet Romania did not declare war on the Soviet Union. Six, France did not declare war on the Soviet Union, though it had a mutual defense treaty with Poland. Seven, England never demanded that the Soviet Union withdraw its troops from western Bielorussia and western Ukraine, the parts of the former Polish state occupied by the Red Army after September 17, 1939. On the contrary, the British government concluded that these territories should not be a part of a future Polish state. 8. The League of Nations did not determine that the Soviet Union had invaded a member state. 9. All countries, including, for example, the United States, accepted the Soviet Union's declaration of neutrality in the Polish-German War. In 1958, in the journal Soviet Studies, UCLA professor George Ginsberg published an article examining the Soviet Union's claim of neutrality in the German-Polish War. With reference to international law and the statements of the parties at the time, Ginsberg concluded that the Soviet Union was indeed neutral and that this neutrality was internationally recognized. Without a government, remember the government had passed into Romania, Poland as a state had ceased to exist under international law. This fact is simply ignored by Polish nationalists and by anti-communists generally, for whom it is highly inconvenient. The Soviet position was valid under international law. In a second article in the American Journal of International Law, Professor Ginsberg determined that the Soviet claim that the state of Poland no longer existed was basically a sound one. To quote Ginsberg's, this is a quote, "De facto, then, one may well accept the view that the Polish government no longer functioned as an effective state power. In such a case, the Soviet claim that Eastern Galicia was in fact a terra nullius, a land belonging to no other state, may not be unjustified and could be sustained." Ginsberg continued, quote, "Theoretically, the Soviet Union still retained a better claim than Poland to the incorporated territories on the basis of the principle of national self-determination. If the ethnic composition of the area's population is taken into account," he's talking about the fact that western Bielorussia and western Ukraine were mainly populated by Belarusians and Ukrainians and not Poles. "4. Though the Soviet title rests on a plebiscite of doubtful validity, the Polish claim derived from a direct act of force and military conquest, not even remotely claiming parentage with the concept of national self-determination." End quote. 6. The Katyn Massacre. What really happened? Anti-communists claim that there is a historical consensus about the Katyn Massacre issue. That is not true. Rather, anti-communists accept without question the version that blames the Soviets for all the shootings and demands that everybody else do so as well, or the anti-communists will call them nasty names. In normal historical discussion, it is considered essential to outline the disputes and disagreements among the experts. In the case of Katyn, it is just the opposite. Proponents of the Soviets did it position refuse to acknowledge the viewpoint they oppose. Or in a few cases, they insult and belittle those who think the Soviet Union did not do it, or call them communists. This is not scholarship, but political propaganda, as though communists cannot be trusted while, by contrast, anti-communists, including the German Nazis, can be. Under such conditions, it is already a declaration of partisanship to acknowledge and discuss the controversy at all. The only objective way to approach the historical dispute about the Katyn Massacre is to begin by acknowledging that such a dispute actually exists. The viewpoint that the Soviets shot all the Poles and that the Nazi report of 1943, aside from its anti-Semitic statements, is entirely truthful, is accepted without question by all anti-communists everywhere, including in Russia. The viewpoint that the Germans shot all the Poles and that the Soviet report of 1944 is the accurate one is accepted by communists and pro-communists, except for Trotskyists, and by many Russian nationalists. In 1990 to 1992, Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin claimed that the Stalin-era leadership of the Soviet Union had indeed shot the Poles. confirming virtually all the details of the anti-communist Polish nationalist version. In 1992, Yeltsin presented to Polish officials facsimiles of documents from the archives in a package called, quote, closed packet number 1, which, if genuine, would put Soviet guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But beginning in 1995, some Russian researchers have argued that these documents were forgeries. Analysis of these documents, mainly by Russian researchers who reject the official version of Katyn, has continued since, growing ever more detailed and sophisticated. But long before this, positions on both sides had hardened. Among those who believed the Soviets guilty, very few changed their opinions on the basis of the new evidence. I count myself among the few, since I changed my own view, shifting from thinking that the Soviets did it to an agnostic position. Since 2010, much more important evidence has come to the fore that casts the strongest doubt upon the official version of Katyn. In Volodymyr Volynski, Ukraine, that's a town in Ukraine, Polish and Ukrainian archaeologists found evidence that at least 2 Polish policemen, believed to have been shot by the Soviets in April or May of 1940, in or near the Soviet city of Kalinin, which is now renamed Tver, Russia, were in fact murdered 700 miles away in the second half of 1941 by the Germans and Ukrainian nationalist allies, after the fascist invasion of the Soviet Union. This fact alone dismantles the official version of the Katyn massacre narrative. These discoveries illustrate how corrupt the history around the Katyn massacre has become. The discovery of the badges of the 2 Polish policemen, previously said to have been shot and buried 16 months or more later and earlier and 700 miles away, is by far the most important find at the Volodymyr Volynski excavation. So why has it not received the publicity that it merits? Undoubtedly because powerful political forces in Poland and Ukraine do not want to publicize it, because it casts doubt upon Soviet guilt. Therefore, it's been hushed up. The Polish archaeological report mentions only one of the Polish policemen's badges. Even that is buried in a footnote with only the most cryptic reference to Katyn, literally a coded reference, understandable only to those who are extremely familiar with the Katyn issue. For example, the word Katyn doesn't appear anywhere. The archaeological report does not mention the discovery of the Ukrainian archaeological report, as opposed to the Polish one, does not mention the discovery of the Polish policemen's badges at all. The cover-up began before this. In October 2010, revelations of draft forgery documents were presented on the floor of the Russian Duma by Duma deputy Viktor Ilyukhin. Yet this dramatic story was virtually blacked out of the mainstream Russian press, to say nothing of the media in the rest of the world. The mass media outside Russia has completely ignored the 2010 discovery of the draft forgery documents, while the mass media outside Poland and Ukraine has ignored the Volodymyr Volynski discoveries. There is good evidence that Ukrainian nationalist forces participated in the mass murders of victims at Volodymyr Volynski. Meanwhile, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists is honored in Western Ukraine. Volodymyr Volynski even has a street named after OUN leader and Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera, whose men participated in the mass murder there, and blame it on the Soviets. Soviet guilt in the Katyn massacre is literally constitutive of post-1990 Polish nationalism. Poland has transformed Katyn into an anti-communist and anti-Russian orgy of veneration for its victims. Polish governments have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on hundreds of monuments and memorials to Katyn. Hundreds of ceremonies, some very large in scope, have been devoted to Katyn, as have hundreds or thousands of publications and the efforts of dozens of scholars. The official version of Katyn is taught in all public Polish schools. In addition to the motive of anti-communism, Katyn is kept alive as a weapon to beat Russia with, for Russia is the heir to the Soviet Union, legally. Poland continues its years-long struggle to have Katyn declared genocide and make Russia pay reparations to the families of its victims. Yet now we know that there was no Katyn, no single chain of events during which the Soviets shot the Polish prisoners of war. But Poland, Ukraine, and anti-communists generally do not want to acknowledge this. Much less do they want their own citizens or the world at large to doubt Soviet guilt at Katyn. The story of Katyn is a fascinating historical conundrum. Any similar event in, for example, American history would have long ago attracted the attention of scores of researchers, professional and amateur. But in Poland it is taboo to question, even for a minute, the official Soviets did it version of Katyn, hence the cover-up and the denial. What really happened? Although the Volodymyr Volynski discoveries definitively refute the official Polish version of Katyn, they do not tell us what really happened. The hypothesis that most closely fits the evidence we have today is that the Germans or their Ukrainian nationalist allies shot most of the Polish POWs. Therefore, there was no Katyn massacre in the sense of the event known to history by that name. The Polish prisoners, officers, and others were killed, but probably in different places where their bodies had never been recovered, as the Volodymyr Volynski site remained unexcavated until a few years ago and has now been closed again. It is possible that we will never learn any more. Neither Poland nor Ukraine, nor at this time Russia, wants to find any evidence that casts doubt upon the official version of Katyn. Much more about this in my book and also in my article. It was published a year ago. 7. The Warsaw Uprising. What really happened? On July 31st, 1944, General Komorowski, commander of the Home Army, loyal to the Polish government in exile in England, gave the order for an uprising in Warsaw against the German occupying forces. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1st to October 2nd, 1944 was a disastrous defeat for the hugely outgunned and outnumbered partisan forces in the city. At least 17,000 insurgents were killed, while the Germans and their allied forces killed about 200,000 civilian residents of Warsaw and destroyed 60% of the buildings in the city. The uprising, this is the Warsaw Uprising, was directed militarily against the Germans, but politically against the Soviet Union, and especially against the Polish forces allied with the Red Army. The Polish Army, Wojska Polskie, and the People's Army, Armia Ludowa. The uprising was a part of the Polish government in exile's Operation Storm. In Polish, this is Busha. This plan was designed to try to seize power in Polish towns once the Red Army crossed into western Bielorussia and western Ukraine, which had formerly been part of Poland. Poland had seized these regions by conquests from Soviet Russia in 1921. And they had been retaken in 1939 after Poland's defeat and merged into the Belarusian and Ukrainian republics of the USSR. Lights, camera, action. Go. Okay. Until the early 1990s, the Polish government in exile, continued to insist that these lands, that's Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, were part of Poland. Operation Storm was designed to present the Soviet government with the necessity of either recognizing the Polish government in exile or of having to arrest its authorized representatives, thus admitting, supposedly, that it was a conqueror, not a liberator. The plan was for Home Army forces in the towns of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus to wait until the Red Army was on the point of liberating a town from the Germans. In the interval between the Germans' withdrawal and the arrival of the Red Army, the Home Army was to occupy the government buildings. When the Red Army arrived, the Home Army was to greet them as the lawful government and representatives of the government in exile. When the Red Army removed them from office and replaced them with their own Polish forces, the Home Army was to inform the government in exile, which would then make a formal protest to the Allies. The Allies would then supposedly make a protest to the Soviet government. No one ever thought that the Home Army and other partisan forces in Warsaw would be able to defeat the German and Allied forces there. These German forces included at various times part or all of 5 tank divisions, one of them an SS division, the German 9th Army, a company of the 29th SS Grenadier Division, the Sonderkommando Dirlewanger, infamous for its savagery against civilians, and a number of Cossack and other forces recruited from anti-communists within the Soviet Union. These forces were supported by Messerschmitt fighters and Stuka dive bombers. The only chance for the success for the Warsaw Uprising was to count on the Red Armies defeating the German forces and driving them out of the city. Then, with a minimum of fighting against retreating troops, the Home Army hoped to take control of Warsaw and present the Red Army with an accomplished fact, a fait accompli. That was the plan. The Home Army leadership started the blame game, pointed fingers at others during the uprising itself. At first they tried to blame the British. Then they decided it was all the Soviets' fault, despite the fact that the uprising was supposed to be directed against the Soviets in the first place. One person Komorowski never blamed was himself. But a great many other Poles, including anti-communists and his own home army members, blamed him at the time and continued to do so. 8. Stalin's anti-Semitism. The subtitle of Bloodlands is Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. It supposedly concerns the years 1933 to 45, when both Hitler and Stalin were in office. So why is there a whole chapter about the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1953? Evidently, Snyder thinks that to seal the comparison, and really it's an equation, between Hitler and Stalin, you must contend that Stalin was anti-Semitic. Since neither Snyder nor any of his anti-communist scholarly facilitators could find evidence of Soviet anti-Semitism between 1933 and 1945, they must try to find it after the war. In this effort, they follow a path laid down by previous anti-communist writers to whom this idea had already occurred. In Blood Lies, I examine Snyder's account of the murder of Solomon Michoels in January 1948, the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, and especially the doctor's plot. I examine all these issues using the latest research and revelations from former Soviet archives. I cite a lot of evidence that Stalin strongly opposed anti-Semitism. This includes the book by Joris Medvedev, Soviet dissident and brother of Roy Medvedev, whose book Stalin and the Jewish Problem, 2003, addresses this issue head-on. Medvedev concludes that Stalin was not anti-Semitic, though he was anti-Zionist. But that book is only available in Russian. Anti-Semitism did, of course, exist within the Soviet Union. It had probably grown during the war, since much of the Soviet population had lived for 3 or more years under Nazi occupation and been subject to intense anti-Semitic propaganda. But the evidence is clear that Stalin strongly and consistently opposed anti-Semitism, and I have a great deal about that in my book. Conclusion. The anti-communist scholars, such as Snyder and those who help him, have all the resources of libraries, archives, and the money of their capitalist states behind them. If there were, in fact, any crimes of Stalinism, it is impossible that such dedicated anti-communists would not have found evidence of them. The fact, therefore, that the professional anti-communist scholars like Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University repeat nothing but lies is the best proof we are ever likely to have that there were no crimes of Stalinism. Before concluding, I have some remarks concerning objectivity, bias, evidence, and how to interpret evidence. I hope you'll bear with me while I read them. There is, of course, much, much more to say about these 8 anti-Stalin lies, and I say it in my book. Then there are literally dozens of other lies in Snyder's book, all with references to anti-communist Polish, Ukrainian, or German scholarship. I have studied them all. All the primary sources are there. And I prove them all to be baseless, and you will see that too when you read the book. I think it will be worth your while to read about them. They illustrate the different strategies of falsification employed by Snyder and other anti-communist writers. This is so important that I devote a chapter to analyzing and categorizing the different types of falsifications in Snyder's book. There are other questions which I don't address directly in the book, such as the Moscow trials, how to use evidence provided by confessions, the issue of torture, and the issue of Leon Trotsky's allegations and writings. I hope we can cover some of these matters during the Q&A period. I think the Q&A is as important as the presentation, since in it I can attempt to respond to those questions and issues that are of the most interest to you, the audience. However, before ending my presentation, I think it's important to say something about 3 issues that always come up and that are central to the study of Soviet history of the Stalin period. These issues are the following. 1, the question of objectivity and the lack of it in historical study. 2, the general ignorance of most readers, including most Marxists, about how to evaluate historical evidence. And 3, the effect of anti-communist propaganda, particularly from supposed left sources such as Trotsky, Khrushchev-era and Gorbachev-era Soviet writers, and from anti-communist Russian researchers today. 1, objectivity. Everybody has biases, but everybody can learn to be objective in studying any subject, whether it be physics and biology or history. The techniques are basically similar. Objectivity as a scientific method is a practice of distrust of the self. One can learn to be objective by training oneself to become aware of, to articulate, and then to doubt one's own preconceived ideas. One must be automatically suspicious of evidence that tends to confirm one's own biases, prejudices, and preferences. One must learn to give an especially generous reading, to search especially hard for, to lean over backwards to consider evidence and arguments that contradict one's own preconceived ideas. Objectivity is a practice, like learning a foreign language. You can become good at it through practice, by deliberate effort. You must do this if you want to learn the truth, and we Marxists want to learn the truth. Marx and Engels wrote that the proletariat has nothing to lose but its chains. By that I assume they meant that we have no sacred cows, nothing we refuse to subject to critical scrutiny. We want to cast aside all illusions and falsehoods. Only the truth shall make us free, if we are the international working class. Marx's favorite slogan was De omnibus dubitandum, question everything. If you want to learn the truth, that's what you must do. And you must question your own preconceived ideas and biases above all others. Moreover, it's what every bourgeois detective in every detective story knows. As Sherlock Holmes used to say, keep your mind free of precipitate conclusions. That means hasty conclusions. Get the facts before you form your hypotheses. Be ready to abandon an hypothesis that does not explain the established facts. If you don't do this, if you don't try to discover the truth from the very outset, then you are not going to stumble upon it by accident along the way, and you won't discover the truth. A common form that this lack of objectivity takes is the demand for certainty. For example, we have a great deal of circumstantial evidence that Leon Trotsky did in fact collaborate with the Germans and Japanese intelligence, as alleged in the Moscow trials. How can this evidence be accounted for except to conclude that Trotsky did in fact collaborate? The most common form is denial. Quote, for example, quote, there is no certainty, therefore it's false. There is a lot of denial in the study of Soviet history. 2, evidence. I find that most people, no matter how intelligent and well-read, do not know how to interpret historical evidence. There's nothing surprising there. Most people have never given much thought to the question. But many people on the left who have some formal education somehow believe that they do know how to evaluate historical evidence, and they don't. One example is the argument from incredulity. This is a logical fallacy. This fallacy takes the general form, quote, I can't believe this, or this is incredible, therefore it is not true. The fact that you disbelieve it is a statement about you, not about the evidence. People tell me all the time, quote, Grover, if you can't convince me, then your argument is faulty. Intelligent people say this to me all the time. Trotsky, who knew all about this, often utilized this argument to great effect. He used to write things like this many times. Quote, who could believe that I would ever join a bloc with Zinoviev and Kamenev? I attacked them often and vehemently in print and would never have had anything to do with them. Now, of course, we know that he was in a bloc with them. Trotsky and other anti-communist writers could never get away with dismissing the Moscow trial's testimony as incredible unless they could rely on the fact that their readers were ignorant of the fallacy of incredulity. This kind of thinking is partly due to ignorance of logic and how to interpret evidence. I think, too, that the arrogance of us intellectuals plays a role here. We think we are such smart people. You have a college degree, you know, a lot of people think, I must be a genius. So if we are not convinced, it is not because we are at fault, but the argument that is at fault. That's a very common error. A couple of other examples. The use of first-person narratives as primary sources. Someone wrote something somewhere that something happened, so it must be true. The historiographical principle being flouted here is called in Latin testis unus testis nullus, meaning one witness is the same as no witnesses. A single witness or testimony cannot ever establish an historical fact. Trotsky knew and utilized this fallacy frequently. 2 examples. This is both taken from Trotsky's biography of Stalin. Trotsky claimed Lenin said that Stalin was, quote, a cook that makes only peppery dishes. Trotsky also claimed that Lenin's wife Krupskaya told him, Trotsky, that, quote, if Ilyich, that is Lenin, were alive today, he would be in an OGPU prison. Trotsky is the only source of these stories. Yet many readers, and of course anti-communist writers, accept them as true because they are convenient to their anti-Stalin bias. Another example, the appeal to torture as denial. The fact is that A, we need evidence that somebody was tortured. We can't simply assume it. B, tortured people can either tell the truth or lie. C, people who are not tortured can also tell the truth or lie. Therefore, even if we could establish that someone was tortured, that does not tell us whether what he testified was true or false. And the same thing is true with those who were not tortured. A third example. An important principle recognized by all objective historians is lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. That is, the fact that there is no evidence something happened does not mean that it did not happen. In the case of a conspiracy, when the conspirators plan to leave no evidence at all, that's what makes it a conspiracy. Lack of evidence is what we should expect. Example, there is no evidence in the German and Japanese archives that Leon Trotsky collaborated with the Germans and Japanese, therefore it is false. Of course, that's not true. Another example, the prosecution, this is an interesting example. The prosecution in the Free Moscow trials of 1936, 1937, and 1938 claimed that there was a block of rights and Trotskyites. Trotsky himself vehemently denied this many times. Under Khrushchev, Soviet researchers claimed that they had scoured the archives and found no trace of such a block. By 1980, therefore, the universal consensus of Trotskyist, Soviet, and Cold War historians was that the block was a fabrication by Stalin. Okay? In 1980, the Trotsky archives at Harvard University were open to researchers. Within a few months, the research team, headed by Pierre Brouet, the foremost Trotskyist scholar in the world, discovered that letters by Trotsky and his son Sedov in that archive confirmed the existence of a block of rights and Trotskyites, formed with Trotsky's permission. Now, the Trotsky archives have been purged. That is, incriminating materials have been removed at some time. This purging was imperfectly done. So Brouet was able to confirm a number of lies by Trotsky, including Trotsky's repeated and vehement denial of the block. But suppose the Trotsky archive had been purged more carefully, so that no evidence of the block remained. All the so-called authorities, Soviet, Russian, anti-communist, and Trotskyist, would be claiming that the block was a Stalinist fabrication. Yet it still would have existed. The only thing is we would not have incontrovertible evidence from Trotsky's own archive that it did. Okay, so that illustrates, right? The fact that there's no evidence that something happened doesn't mean it didn't happen. Another example, anti-communist propaganda and research. This is my third point. All of us are seriously affected by anti-communist propaganda, even when, maybe especially when, we are not aware that we are being affected by it. Much of this has to do with what is called the big lie. Repeat something over and over again, get different so-called authorities to repeat it so that it appears to come from different sources, decorated with scholarly-looking footnotes, and people with scholarly-sounding affiliations, get the mass media to accept it as factual, and it will be believed. This is especially the case with Stalin-era research, since there are sources with a left cover, Trotskyist, Khrushchevite, Gorbachevite, who give the propaganda a kind of credibility among some leftists that blatantly Cold War propaganda could not get by itself. Trotskyism was a small and shrinking sect until Khrushchev gave his secret speech in 1956. According to Trotsky admirer David North, that is what gave modern Trotskyism its biggest boost. Khrushchev's speech. Since then, Trotskyist writers cite Khrushchev and post-Khrushchev Soviet writers as evidence, because their line about Stalin is pretty much identical. My first book in 2007, English language edition 2011, was Khrushchev Lied. Over there. It is important to know, of course, that Khrushchev's secret speech is virtually 100% made up of falsehoods, most or all of which were deliberate. Even more important, though, is what this fact implies. What else did Khrushchev and the Khrushchev-sponsored writers like Roy Medvedev and Alexander Nechayev lie about? The answer is, they lied about pretty much everything about the Stalin years, even about very minor issues, let alone the important ones. Moreover, Khrushchev-era and then Gorbachev-era sources were and remain the bedrock of contemporary Russian, Western, and Trotskyist research. Of the former, I mentioned Robert Conquest, whose works were at the forefront of anti-Stalin and anti-communist phony research for 30 years. Of the Trotskyists, take the works of Vadim Z. Rogovin, the foremost Trotskyist researcher of the Stalin period. Trotskyists rely almost exclusively on these works. Just like the Western Cold War historians, Rogovin and other Trotskyist historians simply accept Khrushchev and Gorbachev-era fact claims as unproblematically true. There is no source criticism in Rogovin's works. No criticism of any kind. If an allegation makes Stalin look bad, into the footnote and narrative it goes. Yet another example of how ignorance of proper research methods, in this case source criticism, dovetails with bias and a lack of objectivity to produce false historical narratives, lies, with scholarly-looking footnotes. These three matters, a failure to adhere to objectivity in historical study, ignorance of how to gather and interpret historical evidence, and anti-communist propaganda from left sources, account for the fact that the history of the Stalin period in the Soviet Union is so seriously distorted and misunderstood. I continue to devote my efforts to studying Soviet history of the Stalin period as objectively as possible, while carefully identifying, locating, obtaining, studying, and drawing appropriate conclusions from the primary source evidence that has become available since the opening of the Trotsky archive and the very partial opening of some former Soviet archives. An accurate understanding of the history of the Stalin period in the Soviet Union is essential if we are to learn the lessons, both positive and negative, of the experience of the first workers' state. And we do not know that history now. All versions of that history, the Khrushchev and post-Khrushchev Soviet versions, including the Gorbachev version, the Trotskyist version, and of course the Cold War, overtly anti-communist versions, all of them are wrong, concocted out of lies. Many of these lies originated in the Soviet Union itself, from Khrushchev and his writers, and then from Gorbachev. The accounts written in the Soviet Union during the Stalin period, and those written by the Chinese Communist Party when they were friendly to Stalin and hostile to Khrushchev, are also very limited in their usefulness. The Stalin-era Soviet versions do not reflect many of the most important contradictions within the Soviet Communist Party at the time. Moreover, these pioneer communists seriously misunderstood the results of the policies they were following, and which they believed would lead to socialism and then to communism. The Chinese Communist Party had little real evidence to go on. Moreover, contradictions similar to those in the Soviet Communist Party and the Soviet Union were also playing out within the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communists could not properly evaluate and learn from the experience of the Soviet Union or understand how its pro-capitalist tendencies had originated and were developing. If we do not learn the lessons, both positive and negative, of the Stalin period in the Soviet Union, we are at best doomed to repeat their experience, which means to repeat their failure. For the Soviet Union did not develop into communism. It is essential to the working class of the world that they learn what the Soviets did was correct, positive, heroic, and what they did was negative, tending towards the restoration of capitalism that eventually took place. I am glad to be able to contribute in some small way towards this important goal. Thank you.